Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk about your next steps on your research projects. By this point in the semester, you identified a topic and some research activities, and hopefully by now you have conducted some of those research activities, a good number of those research activities, meaning you've conducted some interviews, you've started on your observations, you have the published sources identified that you'll be using. And really what we're talking about now in this video is, now that you've collected all that information on your subject, how do you go about processing that information and bringing it together toward what will ultimately become a paper? So that's the next steps that I want to talk about here. So what you'll be engaging in with these materials that you've collected is a sort of analysis. Now, I know you're not professional anthropologists, and you may not have done this kind of analysis before, so that's okay. What I'm going to describe now is a pretty straightforward way to think about what this kind of analysis of materials entails and how to go about it, okay? The main thing that you're going to be doing with your analysis is something quite straightforward, which is to, as I say here, identify points of convergence and divergence. Let me explain what I mean by that. Convergence means points of sameness, or where things complement each other. So in other words, one of the first things you'll be doing is simply looking for patterns. Repetition of ideas or experiences across all the materials that you've collected, okay? Divergence is similar. You're also looking for something that emerges across all the materials that you've collected. But that would be looking for points of difference, right? So let me give you an example. A point of convergence or sameness would be if all the people that you interviewed told you something very similar when you asked them a question, right? Then you could start to go, oh, okay, well, there seems to be a pattern here where all the people involved in, whatever my subject is, all have this kind of opinion, or all have this kind of, they've all had this kind of experience in the past, or whatever it may be, right? That's a point of convergence. That's a pattern where you find something similar is going on in multiple people's experiences, and that's something that you would want to note because that could be an important part of your analysis. On the other hand, you might find when you interview people, or say you interview people and then you do some observations, and you're seeing two different things, and they seem to sort of conflict, or they're different aspects of the phenomenon that you're studying. That might also be something interesting to note, right? What we find when we interview people is not that everybody thinks exactly the same way, right? So if you find, gee, two of the people had this perspective and the two others had the complete opposite perspective, that doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you can talk about that variation. You can talk about that point of difference, okay? So all of this is to say that your analysis will mean that you are going to go through all the materials you've collected. That is, the notes from your interviews, the notes from your observations, and the notes from the published sources that you've read. And you're going to look across all of them for these kinds of patterns. Are there certain themes or issues that seem to emerge from this body of information as a whole? Okay? That's the main thing you're going to be doing in terms of analysis, all right? And that set of patterns or trends or issues or themes that you notice when you look at all that information or data, we can call it data too, those key issues are going to lead you to the argument that you'll make in your paper, which is what I'm going to talk about next, okay? So in other words, this does not have to be a complicated or a high-tech analysis. Literally what I would suggest that you do is take all the notes that you have, right, which I assume you have in some kind of electronic form. You might have some stuff recorded. If you have interviews that are recorded, I suggest, and you haven't done this already, I suggest you listen back to them and take notes on them, right, so that you have sort of a textual form of all the materials you'll be drawing from, right, because then you can sort of start to think about all that information as one body of information. So part of what this analysis also entails is moving from thinking of yourself as having a bunch of separate sources, like interview 1, interview 2, observation 1, observation 2, etc., and thinking of it as all one body of information. So you're starting to look at collectively all the different kinds of things you've collected and see what it all adds up to, right? What ideas or themes or issues or patterns can you discern across all that information you collected, okay? So that's the first step, is to find what are those trends, themes, patterns that emerge, right? When you read through all of your notes, you look back at the sources, if you see things that keep coming up again and again, I would start to write those down as potential points that you might want to talk about in your paper, okay? You don't need to have 50 of those points. If you find 3 to 5 points, right, things that seem important and that come up multiple times, or points of debate and conflict, right? Back to that idea of convergence and divergence. Those things that you identify, make a list of those, all right? Probably be a handful. If you only find one, then I want you to look more deeply. If you find 20, that's too many, and think about collapsing them. But I think you'll find probably a handful of sort of issues that seem like they emerge from this body of data, okay? So that's the first step of your sort of analytical process. And record those, write them down, type them into a Word document, whatever it is, okay? Now, the second step is to make sure that you are prepared to connect those themes, issues, patterns that you've identified with specific evidence, all right? Any kind of research paper is going to involve both big ideas and specific evidence that backs it up. There's always that pairing, all right? So what I was just describing, where you find those ideas, themes, issues, patterns, that's finding the big ideas, right? You need to also then, in your paper, support where that theme came from. You can't just say, hey, here's what I think's going on, right? You need to go, here's what I think's going on, and here's why. And the here's why is the evidence, all right? So once you've jotted down those, again, handful, say 3 to 5 key themes or issues that have emerged from the information you've collected, I want you then to attach evidence to it. This evidence should come, ideally, the best case scenario is that you find evidence for your themes from across all the kinds, all the categories of information you've collected. That means interviews, observations, and published sources, okay? So, is there something that somebody said in an interview that resonates with something you observed on a different day, and that also resonates with something you read in one of your articles? That kind of lateral connection across different categories of information is really great, because then you have a really robust sort of set of evidence for that point that you're making. It makes you, puts you in a better position to really make a good argument about it, right? You're saying this is not just something I'm sort of, coming up with off the top of my head, right? Here's a key important thing that's going on here, and I know that because these people said this, I saw this happen, and this is also backed up by something that other anthropologists have found, right, in their research. You will find that you can't always, for every point or theme or trend that you find, you can't find evidence in all 3 categories. That's okay, right? If you have evidence only from the interviews, that's fine, right? But look across all the kinds of sources that you're using and see if there's something that allows you to bring in those different sorts of information as well, okay? So once you have your key issues, your themes, and the specific evidence from the material you collected that connects to those themes, you are in an excellent position to start figuring out the overall outline of your paper, okay? Those points with the connected evidence will make up the body of your paper. That will be sort of the main part of your paper, okay? That's where the most important information will be discussed and described. The body of the paper, right, where you're sort of talking through all those things, will be framed by what I like to think of as the bookends of the introduction and the conclusion, okay? So the most important information in a paper is relayed in the sort of in the middle. That's where you really work through all the evidence and talk through all the ideas. But at the very beginning of the paper, in the introduction, is where you state in a succinct and direct way what the main, most important point of the paper is. And that is what your argument or thesis statement is, okay? So I want to move on to talking a little bit about what that is. And I'm going to guess that some of you have at least heard this phrase, thesis statement, or have written a paper where you were asked to include a thesis statement. This is nothing to be worried about. I think sometimes there's some stress around the idea of what a thesis statement is. Thesis statement is something super simple. And the best thesis statement literally takes the form of one simple sentence, okay? So it's not something that is, a big, laborious thing. It is something that it's important to try to get as well as you can to capture what you're trying to convey in your paper, okay? So if what I was just describing, where you're identifying themes, you're connecting evidence to it, and you're talking through it, right, that'll be the body of your paper. What you're going to do at the very beginning of the paper, in the introduction, is you're going to say, here's the subject of my paper, right, sort of a brief overview of what your paper's about, and you're going to follow that with a sentence that encapsulates the main argument or main claim that you will be making with this paper. So all those themes and points and evidence that I was talking about in the last slide, basically you want to find the overarching main point that is sort of above all those smaller thematic issues that you've identified across your sources, okay? So if you had to sum up in one sentence, here's the main thing that I want my reader to take home, the end of all this, that's your thesis statement, okay? Now, sometimes I think it seems counterintuitive to students that big, overarching, like, ta-da moment happens at the beginning of the paper, right? I think we're often used to thinking of things as having sort of a lead up to a grand finale, right? Like the important thing happens at the end, right? Like what happens at the end of a movie, right? That's what you want to know. Like, how does it end? Like, what happens? Academic papers actually do that sequence sort of in reverse. So an academic paper, like the one you're writing for this class, instead of waiting with bated breath for what's going to happen until the very last frame of the movie, instead, the academic writer tells you what happened in the first paragraph and then goes back and rolls out, okay, so now I guess you want to know how I got to that main point. Well, here it is. Here's what I found. Here's how it connects. Here's the evidence, etc. Okay? So that's why this thesis statement is important, and that's why it goes in the intro, okay? Typically, it will be the last sentence of your introduction is where you go, in this paper, I'm going to argue blank, okay? And literally, and I know this is also something that seems sort of almost off-putting to people, you can say it just like that. Like, you don't have to, pretend like you're not saying your thesis. You can be very sort of clear about it. You can say, in this paper, I will argue that blah, 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 blah. Or I will suggest, or my claim is, okay? So you don't need to sort of bury it in the introduction. You can come right out and articulate it as your argument, okay? Now, that thesis statement, like I said, it's sort of important because it sets the tone, and it's a sort of guidepost for the reader going through the rest of the paper, right? You're saying to the reader, look, here's where I'm heading with this whole thing. Here's where I'm going to land. And then the reader knows that as they're reading all the smaller points and pieces of evidence that you're describing. So you want to make sure you give them the right guidepost, right? You want to make sure that you really are sort of clear and accurate about what your paper's going to land on. So you don't sort of send them thinking the wrong thing as they're reading the rest of your paper, okay? So here on this slide, this is to help you think about how how to sort of formulate a thesis statement and really what a good, strong thesis statement looks like or what characteristics it has, okay? These are 4 qualities that are important for a successful, a powerful, a robust thesis statement, okay? And that's it. That is that a thesis statement should be significant, it should be debatable, it should be specific, and it should be clear, okay? This is what to strive for. Now, let me explain what I mean by each of these qualities. It should be significant. What I mean by that is that you want that main claim, that argument, to be something that is worth arguing about, right? Something that, you know, as I say here, you don't want your reader to hear your argument and think, so what? Like it doesn't matter, right? So think about what is important about what you found and what you can say. And that can be important for clarifying things that people don't know about the phenomenon that you've studied. It can be significant because it's adding a new layer to things that anthropologists have studied before, right? But you want it to be something that there's a sense that you're contributing something new to our conversations about that subject, okay? You also want it to be debatable. As I said here, you don't want your reader to say, well, everybody already knows that, right? So debatable in the sense that what you're saying is something that, again, it doesn't just go without saying. It's something that someone could take a different perspective on, right? That's the reason for you to make an argument about it, because it's not just sort of totally cut and dried. Like, of course, that's what's going on here, right? So it shouldn't be something that's so obvious or so already well known that you're not, again, adding something to the conversation. So you want it to be debatable. The third quality is that it's specific. And I know that also sometimes feels sort of contradictory, like I'm saying it has to be significant, like it has to be important, but specific, but small, right? And really what I mean by specific is that it's focused, okay? One way to think about this issue of specificity or narrowness is that you are trying to say bigger, more important things in your paper, but the best way to do that is to focus your lens on something specific, right? If you try to talk about everything, or you have too broad of a sort of frame on something, then it just feels sort of vague or diffuse. You can't dig into the details that will allow you to get at some of those bigger, more important issues, okay? So you also want your thesis to be specific about what you studied, okay? And then finally, you want it to be clear. And when I say clear here, I'm mainly talking about the language of the thesis statement. It doesn't need to be a big, long, complicated sentence. It doesn't need to use complicated jargon. And in fact, too much jargon can actually work against a thesis statement. You want it to be something that someone can read and they know exactly what you're talking about, right? They don't need to agree with you, per se. You're going to make the argument as the paper goes along. But it needs to be something that is not leave the person confused or needing to run to a dictionary, okay? So the clearer it is, the more simple and straightforward it is, the stronger it will be. And that's easier said than done, right? I understand that all of this is challenging. Condensing your idea, your main idea, into this sort of one clear, simple sentence that also, you know, does a lot of work for the paper is a challenge. But again, these are the qualities that I want you to strive for. And as you're drafting the thesis statement, you know, look back at these characteristics and see if you think that your draft thesis statement meets these qualities, okay? And you can use that also to help you revise. Okay. Now, this is information that you already have on the handout. And again, if you need to remind yourself of the details on the handout for this project, make sure to do so as you continue to work. But I also wanted to then remind you of sort of the form that the final paper will take, and make it clear sort of where the things that I've been talking about in this video fit in terms of that format, right? Because as I already sort of alluded to earlier, the way one analyzes information from a research project and starts sort of drafting out that information means that the way you write a paper is not from beginning to end, okay? You write basically the middle of the paper first, and then you write the introduction and the conclusion. So I know it feels like it's not the right sequence, right? But the reason for that is you need to do the analysis that I started this video with, and you need to know what the body of the paper is going to say before you're in a good position to craft an introduction and a thesis statement, right? If you write a thesis statement before you've done the analysis and figured out what the body of the paper is going to say, it's likely to not actually capture your main ideas, right? The format that the paper will take when it's done, which is what's on this slide, is not the same as the sequence in which you will create these components of the paper, okay? The analysis section is what is actually in the middle. As you see, it's the second bullet here, okay? So, ultimately, once you've done all the work that I've been talking about here and written everything out, this is the sequence that your paper will flow in, okay? So your paper will start with an introduction. You will, in that introduction, talk about, very briefly, here's the topic of my paper, right? Here's the subject, here's the context, right? In a paragraph, say. And in that introduction, you will also state your thesis. Your thesis is a clear statement of what you will be claiming or suggesting in the course of your paper. It's your argument, right? That's what we were just talking about. It's a sentence. Now, the thesis statement is a sentence. Again, you're going to embed it in an introduction. So the introduction, you have room in there to provide enough context for the thesis statement to make sense, right? So introduce what your subject of your paper is, something that will allow the reader to sort of enter that world, and then say, again, something to the effect of, in this paper, I want to argue that, or I found that, or one of the most important things to learn about this is blank, and that's your thesis statement, okay? After that introduction, and again, as a sidebar, I strongly encourage you to actually divide your final paper up into subsections, each with its own title. First of all, give your overall paper a title, okay? You'd be surprised how many fabulous papers I receive from students and they don't have a title. So this is your work. You've put a lot of time into it. Give your paper a title. And then give the subsections of the paper their own little titles, right? So you can call the first section Introduction. There's nothing wrong with that. Published papers have sections called Introduction, so you can just call it Introduction. You can call it Introduction : blah, blah, blah. If you want to call it something fancier, that's fine too. The middle section of the paper, you can just call it Analysis, or even better would be, I talked about how what is going to be in this middle section, this analysis section, is going to be your discussion of the most important themes that emerged from your research and the evidence that connects to them. So an even better and clearer way to organize it is to talk about each of those themes and its connected evidence as a separate subsection. So if you, for example, find 3 major themes, you would have 3 subsections in the middle of the paper, each with a little title, right, that indicates what that theme is, all right? You've probably noticed, if you look back at the readings for the course and how they're organized, you'll notice that none of those published articles are just continuous text, right? It's not just one big block of text. All of those published academic papers are divided into subsections, right? So you divide it up like that, and you do those titled subsections within the paper to provide something like an outline and, again, some guidelines for the reader to follow you, okay? So that's a suggestion, that in this analysis section, where you're talking about the most important themes backed up by evidence from your interviews, observations, and published sources, that you organize that in terms of titled subsections that reflect those themes, okay? Or you could put them all together and just give it one title for the analysis section, or you could just call it analysis. That's the sort of most straightforward way. But again, I think it will be easier to write and clearer for you writing it if you actually divide it into those sections, okay? And then at the end of the paper, you're going to have a conclusion. And again, fine to call it conclusion. Nothing wrong with that. Or you can give it another title. Or you can call it conclusion : something specific about my paper, right? So the conclusion is the other bookend that's the pair with the intro, right? I called them bookends earlier. And what I mean by that is that they sort of provide a frame for the paper, and they're parallel to one another. So they're similar in their weight, so to speak, okay? So the conclusion, the main thing I want to do in the conclusion is basically to return to what you laid out in the intro and demonstrate or reiterate that you accomplished, right, the argument you set out to make. And you can add something else in the conclusion if you want to, right? For example, something that people sometimes include in conclusions is something to the effect of, so, here, again, here's how I have accomplished what I set out to accomplish in this paper. I've made the argument that I mentioned in the thesis statement by doing blah, blah, blah. And some will end with something like, and, something I couldn't address was this. Or a theme that came up, this theme, I didn't have the space to discuss it here, but I think it's an important subject for future research, right? So you can do something like that, like sort of passing the baton on to somebody else, okay? But the main thing to do in the conclusion is to return to what you laid out in the intro and sort of close it. You don't want one bookend, just the intro, and then the thing will fall over. So you need a conclusion that's the other bookend that will hold up the paper on the other side, okay? Okay. So that's those are the main points that I wanted to cover in this video, right? In terms of those next steps. You will be doing a research update in the near future, and I will give you feedback on that. So there are still plenty of points in the semester for us to talk about where you're at and for me to give you feedback on your process. But this video is meant really just to sort of give you a handbook of sorts, right, or a set of steps in terms of moving from collecting data to analyzing data to writing up the paper, okay? So there's still, again, a couple of other check-ins that we will do at another video before the end, but hopefully this has helped you as you move along your trajectory towards your final project. So good luck, and we'll talk soon.